in a minute. Rebecca will speak for about 10 minutes on some of the important work she's been doing her entire career on this issue. We will then have Francisco just mentioned the important legislation introduced by Representative Raul Grijalva, and we are honored to have Ruben Reyes here as district manager and senior advisor to talk about that legislation. And we will then have Vice Chairman Robert Valencia talk about some of the best practices that his tribe is engaged in, as well as how this issue unites Indigenous people from around the world. So with that, do we have Rebecca up yet, Michelle?
Yeah.
Great. It is really my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Adamson. Rebecca has been engaged in the international Indigenous human rights struggle long before most of my students' parents were born. She has really been an innovator, a leader. If you go down her resume, it's amazing the impact that she has had on the issue of Indigenous peoples and finance. You know, you hear the phrase follow the money. Rebecca's turn of phrase is get the money and give it to Indigenous communities. And that's what she's been. She's founder. Appreciate that. I know Rebecca's been a longtime supporter and friend and colleague of Special Rapporteur Calí. She's a great supporter of our program. Founder and president of First Peoples Worldwide, she established the First Nations Development Institute, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. She created the first micro enterprise loan fund. She's on the board of directors of the Bay and Paul Foundations, and she is a strong supporter of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Initiative to follow up on the recommendations and work that Francisco and the IPLP external support team did on that so important 2022 report to the General Assembly on protected areas and Indigenous people. So, Rebecca said, what would you like me to talk to? I'll talk anything you want, Rebecca. I know it's going to shake the world, so go for it.
Thank you so much, Rob. That's a hard act to follow. I want to say the important work I'm doing is supporting you guys. So I want to also, though, seriously express deep appreciation for the team. Actually, I guess the teams that have put the symposium together, and for everyone that's here and part of this now. I first ran into fortress conservation when I was working in Botswana, with the San people, and Conservation International was working with the government to get them evicted from the Kalahari, their traditional lands, to make way for a wildlife corridor. I couldn't understand at the time why they weren't coming in trying to work with the San people, since they had clearly stewarded the desert for about 40,000 years. And in fact, the World Bank had an independent evaluation group compare the different kinds of conservation around the world. And the finding was Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge was twice as effective as any other conservation in the world. So that made me wonder, well, then what are they doing if it's not conservation? And then I followed the money. And I looked at the GEF and the USAID, the big global funders, to see how the conservation money was going. And in short, 83% of the grants were staying in the conservation organizations, and about 17% of the money was going out to the country and then on into Indigenous communities in the name of Indigenous conservation. So when 3030 came on the agenda, I really turned to the Bay and Paul family foundations, and I said, we have got to support the front line on this. 3030 could become the largest land grab in all of history if we can't help build an Indigenous peoples movement around that. And that's how the Bay and Paul Foundations got involved in supporting different parts of what we hope is going to grow into a global movement for the rights of Indigenous people in conservation in protected areas. But it just got a whole lot worse, you guys. I'm also, in addition to having served on the Bay Paul Foundation, I'm a senior advisor to the Wharton Business School on environmental, social, and governance investing. And in September 14th, 2021, just 2.5 years ago, the New York Stock Exchange declared nature as a new asset class. Nature and the benefits of nature are now assets to be publicly traded, which means Mother Earth is for sale. Globally, the natural assets are estimated to produce $125 trillion in ecosystem services annually. I mean, they're tracking this now. The market is running in. Mother Earth's total value is estimated to be $4,000 trillion. Here's a quote from the Securities Exchange Commission, which is in partnership with the New York Stock Exchange to make this happen. This formidable output of nature underscores the financial potential of an asset class that is wholly based on environmental investments. Nature will now be traded through natural asset companies, or they're being called NACs, N-A-C-S. NACs are the private sector enterprises that will hold the rights to ecosystem services produced by nature, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, clean water, more and more. Right now, they've been cataloging. We know we have 80% of the biodiversity, 50% of the inland waters, 40% of the terrestrial areas, 33% of the intact forest landscapes, 70% of the tropical forests. That's huge. So why I wanted to ask for just one moment in what I'm hoping the conversation can begin to explore and maybe even look at going further is we actually need an Indigenous peoples financial policy, an Indigenous peoples conservation financial policy, because the Securities Exchange Commission and the New York Stock Exchange are now seeking a unique set of what they call listing requirements, which will designate who can be a natural asset company and what a natural asset company can do. They're doing this totally without any Indigenous peoples input. We need to come to the foreground, get to the table and say, we have Indigenous peoples financial conservation policy. One, we decide who's eligible to get this funding. They have to definitely not have any violations of human rights or Indigenous peoples' rights. We define how the services will be delivered with transparency. Maybe we want them to have, and definitely we want them to have Indigenous people on the board. And then we hold annual impact assessments so we can see what the actual outputs and performances. How much better is this going to make our Indigenous communities? But we have to get ahead of this. The details can be unfolding, but what we need to do is come to the forefront at the end of this conference, deciding that this is now on our agenda. We have to look at an Indigenous peoples conservation finance policy to begin to redirect the capital flows. Like Rob said, it's now no longer following it's the money. It's now about controlling the money. I'm done. That's my commercial break. Thank you so much.